and welcome to this video focusing on Edward VI and the stability of the monarchy. So Edward VI was 10 years old when he inherited the crown, and this meant that England was now under minority rule. And this presented many problems about the security of the throne. Firstly, a 10-year-old could not lead troops into war. This meant that England could be open to foreign exploitation, as any foreign leader could swoop in and take over England. Also, there was a factional struggle, and this could have led to a civil war, as there was great divide between Protestants and Catholics among the council of leaders. Also, a 10-year-old would not be viewed as powerful, so the respect and authority of England in Europe would be lessened. And also, Edward inherited a really bad financial situation. Because of Henry VIII's last attempts at getting proper wars, the coin had been debased, which is when the gold and silver is taken out of the coins so they're worth less. Edward also inherited the wars with Scotland and France, so this bad economic situation meant that food prices and rents were really high, and this led to a general dissatisfaction among the lower classes of society. So because of all these issues that came with the minority reign, Henry VIII had intended for there to be a balanced council of nobility that would rule for Edward until he was old enough to properly be king. However, the Duke of Somerset, or Edward Seymour, took over this council and named himself the Lord Protector. He issued 77 proclamations in 2 years, so he really took on the role of king, and he's also responsible for the crucial Treason Act of 1547. This act repealed all the previous laws about heresy, treason, censorship, and also the Act of Six Articles, which Henry had passed in his later years, and it was a very Catholic act. All of this allowed people to discuss religion freely for the first time in England, however this led to a lot of riots and general disorder. Somerset also decided to invade Scotland and France and start a war on 2 fronts. He spent £500,000 and it was a completely massive failure. Because of his Protestant religious policy, the Duke of Somerset is often remembered as the good Duke, however there's evidence to suggest he really wasn't. He had a massive income and he refused to listen to others' advice and was basically a dictatorship. His influence as Lord Protector was still slightly limited. He was only a moderate Protestant, unlike Edward, who was a really strong Protestant. The First Book of Common Prayer still contains some Catholic practices such as transubstantiation, which is the belief that the wine and bread is the body and blood of Christ. And it also provoked a lot of unrest throughout England, and also he was never actually king, so his power was always going to be limited. In 1549, the Duke of Somerset fell from power for many reasons. Firstly, his religious policy, as many in England were still against Protestantism, and he introduced quite radical changes. His foreign policy was a big failure, as the wars with Scotland and France. He also contributed to a lot of social problems, such as the coin debasement, the Vagrancy Act, which was very harsh and unfair, and he was blamed for all the unrest that happened during Edward's reign. His personality meant that he monopolised his power and was reluctant to delegate. He ignored the advice of the Privy Council and was very often favouritism. So he was a big dictator, basically. The final straw was his really obvious manipulation of Edward, who was still a child. He would give him pocket money and actually kidnapped Edward to Windsor Castle. Edward finally turned against him, and then the council turned against him, and in 1552 he was executed. This all suggests that the monarchy was very unstable, but it wasn't really Edward's fault. It was almost inevitable, as these problems always happen when there's a minor as the king. The power vacuum left by the Duke of Somerset was filled by the Duke of Northumberland, or John Dudley. He took control of the Privy Council by leading the anti-Somerset faction and allying with earls such as the Earl of Southampton, until eventually naming himself Lord President of the Council. In terms of Northumberland's government, he was actually kind of good. He regularly consulted the Privy Council for advice and was very democratic in his leadership. He also introduced Lord Lieutenants, who were these guys all over England, who each had a small cavalry ready to put down any disorders. He introduced laws to stop unlawful assemblies, so this ended all the riots that had come with the freedom of religious expression under Somerset. And he also made 12 new Privy Council members. With his foreign policy, he gave up Bologna in 1550 and made peace with France, as well as peace with Scotland in 1551. He spent money building up England's defences, and also worked hard to remain neutral between France and the Holy Roman Empire, so this prevented unnecessary wars. He was also very good at getting the crown finances in order. He sold unnecessary crown lands and was very strict about collecting debts. He had the Royal Commission investigate things with the revenue courts, and he ended unnecessary wars with Scotland and France. For giving up Bologna, he got £140,000 per year. Finally, he kind of solved a lot of the social problems as well. He passed legislation to protect arable farming, and he also made poor laws to help fund poor people. He eliminated foreign debt, and he stabilised the currency and food prices by ending coin debasement. So overall, the Duke of Northumberland was very good at stabilising the monarchy. All of this stability ended when in 1553 it became quite clear that Edward was dying. Now, under the 1534 Succession Act passed by Henry VIII, after Edward the crown was supposed to go to Mary. However, Edward did not want this, as Mary was a very strong Catholic. She was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and he knew that if she were queen, she would reintroduce Catholicism and undo all of his religious reform. So, in May 1553, Edward wrote the device for the succession, which completely excluded his sisters Mary and Elizabeth from the crown. His reasoning was that they were illegitimate half-bloods who would marry foreigners, and so England would be under foreign rule. However, his real reason was probably because he wanted to preserve Protestantism. Instead, he named Lady Jane Grey, or her male heirs, whichever happened first, as the next ruler of England. She was the granddaughter of Henry's sister, so she had a very weak and flimsy claim to the throne, but she was a Protestant. Unlike the 1534 Succession Act, the device for the succession was not approved by Parliament, and also it's a little bit shady because Lady Jane Grey was actually engaged to the Duke of Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, so it's quite clear that the device for the succession was there to prolong Northumberland's power as well as preserve Edward's religious reform.